Good morning and good afternoon and good evening to our listeners all around the world. And welcome to today's CSAG webinar, which I am moderating. My name is Margaret Heisel. My background is in Latin American studies and Spanish, and after faculty positions for a number of years, I spent most of my career as an executive at the University of California Office of the President office, which is the office that oversees the 10 campuses. And the latter stages of my career, I was working with the Association of on International Education Issues at the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities and at NAFSA, which is the Association of International Educators, also in Washington, D.C. Now, turning to the subject of today's webinar, we are going to be looking at COVID-19 effects on higher education in countries all around the globe. We are going to hear reports and analyses of this very important subject from 3 university leaders in Asia, Europe, and Africa. As you hear our speakers today, you may use the chat function on YouTube to ask questions of our speakers. Some of you have already submitted questions as a part of your registration. Now, turning to the subject for today, the effects of COVID-19 are certainly profound, far-reaching, and important to higher education. As just a couple of words of background on the subject, in January of 2020, the World Health Organization announced discovery of a new virus that they called COVID-19, which the WHO then declared to be a pandemic in March 2020, just past a year ago. As of April 2020, higher education institutions closed down most campus activities in 185 countries for protection of their students, faculty, and staff, and to limit communication of the virus. This was simply a part of very broad restrictions, social restrictions throughout countries. About half of the world's population was in lockdown. The pandemic forced immediate distance teaching and learning on university campuses and had a profound impact, obviously, on international student mobility. University research, of course, was also deeply impacted through prohibitions on travel and very strict limits on presence in research labs and on various research methodology. Most all features of university functioning were moved abruptly online, placing much deep pressure on institutions' technological infrastructures and creating problems for any students without access to the internet or proper tech equipment. And in some cases, of course, it also required faculty professional development with regard to online teaching. But at the same time, looking at all of these restrictions and challenges, these changes have sparked a lot of interest in the use of online instruction and learning for the future, and that's a subject I think we're all also interested in. Now, we're going to hear from 3 very distinguished higher education leaders who have addressed and are responsible for these great challenges, and they have developed policies to serve their institutions. So we will be able to hear background on this subject in 3 regions. First, we will hear from Ahmed Bawa, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Universities South Africa, which is a representative umbrella body of 26 public universities. He is a theoretical physicist by education, and recently he has been working on a whole range of issues in the relationship of higher education and development and science subjects and society, subjects which obviously are certainly relevant to today's discussion. Next, we will hear from Thomas Hofmeister, who is Vice President Academic at the University of Bremen, a mid-sized university of 19,000 students in northwestern Germany, and a member of YUFE, the Young Universities for the Future of Europe, which is a consortium within the European Universities Initiative. As Vice President, he is responsible for all facets of teaching and learning, including quality management for the past 6.5 years. Thomas is a founding member of a network of vice presidents for teaching and learning in German universities, and a member of the Standing Commission for Teaching and Learning of the German Rectors Conference. He is a biologist by training and holds a professorship in population ecology and evolutionary ecology at the University of Bremen. Interesting subjects. Our third speaker, welcome Professor Raj Kumar, who is founding Vice Chancellor of the O.P. Jindal Global University in India. Professor Kumar has academic degrees from the universities of Oxford, Harvard, Hong Kong, Delhi, and Loyola College. Professor Kumar conceived the idea for establishing India's first global university. He is an accomplished legal scholar and works in the fields of human rights and development, comparative constitutional law, terrorism and national security, corruption and governance, law and, here's a good one, disaster management, legal education, and higher education, and has over 200 publications to his credit. Welcome and thank you to all three of our speakers. Ahmed, shall we begin?
Thank you so much, Margaret, and it's a great pleasure to be a part of this esteemed panel, and I really do appreciate this very much, this opportunity very much. South Africa is one of the world's most unequal societies, and one of the things that we knew at the very outset, when COVID-19 hit us, was that COVID-19 was going to exacerbate that inequality, that it was going to really tear apart, all the kind of the facades, if you like, that held the society together. And in fact, when we went into the first lockdown, very soon after the virus was detected in South Africa, it took not more than a few days for us to see the impact of that lockdown on very essential human needs. So we saw massive challenges with food security, health security, and so on. And it took just a very short time after that for the government to kind of really come together, to pull together teams of people to try and understand how to address the needs of COVID-19 at the same time as addressing the great human challenges that we faced. Of course, the universities were not immune from this. The South African university system is deeply unequal in terms of its institutions. So we have institutions that are very well established, international research institutions like the University of Cape Town, University of Witwatersrand, University of Stellenbosch, and so on. And then there's a whole range of other institutions which were created by the apartheid state all those years ago to cater for people in kind of rural contexts, so in peri-urban contexts and so on. And that divide between institutions, even 27 years after democracy came to South Africa, that inequality between institutions still persists. But of course, South Africa being an unequal society, there are also enormous inequalities between students, if you like, at our institutions. So, and so when COVID-19 kind of made its presence felt, as you point out, like other societies, one of the reactions was to immediately shut down the universities and to try and bring things under control, if you like, to some extent. But of course, what that meant was now to come to grips with how to continue with the academic year and how to try and ensure that we would come to some sort of system to bring that academic year to completion. Now, what you have to remember, of course, is that the academic year in South Africa starts in January. So the universities had just begun the academic year, then went into shutdown, and then were left with this big challenge of completing the academic year, if you like. And it became clear very early on that there was this very grave danger of thousands of students not being able to complete the academic year simply because they didn't have the wherewithal, to kind of participate in kind of this rapid shift to online learning. When I say thousands, I mean really tens of thousands of students, who would tens of thousands of students who would not have been able to complete, maybe even hundreds of thousands of students who would not have been able to complete the academic year. So the 26 universities, the 26 public universities in South Africa then came together, and we decided to really work together to try and ensure that there was a sectoral approach, if you like, to try and ensure that every student would be given a chance to complete the academic year, that there would be attempts made to try and ensure that even those students who were struggling to get access to online learning and so on would be given a chance. So there was a slogan that was adopted by the 26 universities, and the slogan was, no student would be left behind. I mean, and that we would we would do everything we could to try and ensure that students would have the opportunity of completing the academic year. So there were a whole range of national negotiations and so on between the universities and government, between the universities and the mobile network operators, between the universities and the student organizations, to try and ensure that we adopted kind of a holistic approach, if you like, to address the challenge left with, that COVID-19 left us with. And I think the important point to make here is that we realized quite early on that one of the most fundamental challenges we face is to try and produce a kind of a national approach to addressing the challenges of COVID-19. So one of the things that we did was we galvanized an organization called Higher Health, which was created by University of South Africa some years ago. We galvanized that organization to become the organization that would provide the basis for the universities to adopt kind of protocols and public health guidelines and so on, to allow them to become safe, if you like, for the return of students. So that was a national approach. And what we did was galvanized resources for that organization. And that organization then created the platform for all 26 universities to put in place all the public health protocols. So screening, masking, you name it, whatever was required, social distancing and all of that, but in great detail with a lot of publicity, and to try and ensure that there would be buy-in, not just from the universities, but also from students and staff and so on. And I think that was very successful, and it was really something that helped us very much to begin to reintroduce students onto campus. But one of the things that we also then did with Higher Health was to try and understand how to ensure that that technology was used, for example, to try and ensure that screening was done on a regular basis, that students would be provided with opportunities of kind of engaging in conversations about how to manage themselves on campus and so on. And so one of the things we did was to establish a social compact, if you like, at the national level between the student organizations, the staff unions and the academic unions and the universities, a social compact that would really kind of try and get students and staff to understand that a lot of the responsibility with regard to COVID-19 really rested with them and their behavior. So to try and ensure that that there was buy-in, if you like, to a national approach to prevent outbreaks and so on. Now, of course, all of that really has galvanized a lot of new interest now in adopting a kind of social compact approach to other problems that we face in society in South Africa. Um, the one thing that was really very important, of course, was a massive repurposing of research to address the challenges of COVID-19. So repurposing of biomedical research, public health research, engineering research, natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, but just an outpouring of interest, if you like, amongst in the research community. So, for example, on the biomedical side, a range of South African scientists were carrying out massive kind of work on vaccine development, on vaccine testing, on working on new drugs and trying to understand whether there could be repurposing of drugs to address the challenges of COVID-19. The epidemiologists were really central to the challenges that we were facing, and we have a very substantial epidemiological enterprise going on in South Africa because of HIV/AIDS, and that kind of really was repurposed for COVID-19. Engineering faculties turned to designing non-invasive ventilators, so that became a really big enterprise, and there were strong partnerships between the universities and the industrial sector to produce those ventilators. A whole range of the use of additive manufacturing of PPEs, masks, and what do you call them, shields, and all of that kind of jazz. A whole lot of work going on in that direction. And of course, the social scientists came to the party and continue to play a very big role in this area. And also, there's been some really interesting work done in the humanities around kind of investigating the way in which pandemics like the COVID-19 pandemic impacts on culture and traditional health systems and so on and so forth. So coming out of COVID-19, there are 3 or 4 major kind of enterprises. The one is just this idea that we have to work in concert with each other, that we have to bring together individual institutions to work with each other, to bring government to the party, to work constructively with government, even though we very often fight with government, but also to work closely with the private sector to try and ensure that the private sector understands the big challenges we face, and in particular around data provision, connectivity, and all of that. And finally, I should just mention that one of the things that we are working on now is the development of a national digital teaching and learning platform that will provide a service to all 26 universities and the college sector. We have a college sector as well. But the idea being that this platform will now become the basis for all 26 universities to shift to blended learning, if you like, and to try and ensure that the access to learning can grow. So a whole range of lessons from COVID-19. But the biggest challenge we face now, and I think it's a challenge that many universities are facing, is a deep concern about the long-term sustainability of the higher education system. The universities have taken a severe knock during this period, and the government, the government, of course, has also put out a clear indication of how tight the fiscus is because of the impact on the economy, and that, of course, has long-term implications for the university. So that's something that we are now focusing on very much, which is to try and understand how to ensure the long-term sustainability of our universities. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Ahmed, that was terrific. Very interesting to hear about the sectors of society working together. Now, I turn to Thomas.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. I will kind of contrast that a little bit to what Ahmed said, because Germany is in a very different position, of course. The university system is completely different, and maybe also the societal consequences that you just mentioned are somewhat different. So what happens? First, I have to say our teaching term doesn't start in January, but it starts in April. And so we were not hit mid-term, but actually in Europe, we could look to Italy, what's happening there, and we were kind of warned, even though very late. So we had 3 weeks to prepare for everything. And now you would say, well, Germany is a rich country. They should be able to shift teaching to digital very easily. That wasn't the case. So first of all, it's a matter of culture. And we have used blended learning mainly for years as supplement to our traditional teaching methods, and not as a substantial method to convey information or to discuss matters with students. And so we were kind of shocked. We had these 3 weeks, and of course everybody was working like hell, and we managed to deliver roughly 90 to 95%, and I think that's nationwide, of the teaching that's not lab-based in that semester. And of course, the situation for the students differs dramatically from your country. We have roughly 4% students that didn't have access either to internet or to a computer where they were at home. So almost all of the students could work with us through the internet once they were blocked from going to the campus. And then the question was, how does that play out, for example, with enrollments, and what is the general strategy? So you know that while many other countries have high tuition fees, Germany has not. We have a state paid system. And of course, that means that especially last fall, all the international students couldn't come. We don't have that many international students like you, probably. We have roughly 12 to 14% in the universities, but many of them couldn't travel to Germany. And at that point in the fall, we were in a position where we could offer them to study from Nigeria or from Ghana or from Pakistan, for wherever they were sitting, with us through the internet. And that worked quite well, I have to say. And so we were not dependent on delivering them something for a high tuition fee. So they were happy that they could join us, even though the service was perhaps less good compared to other years. We had much other problems. So you know that we have a federal state. So we don't have the same rules of the game all over the place. So state by state, our rules would differ in, for example, at what time we would have a lockdown, or what would be the conditions on the campus. And in our case, at the state of Bremen, so that's in the northwestern end of Germany, we had the rule that we had our president, together with the other presidents of the university and the universities of applied sciences, together with the Ministry of Science, and they were debating about the rules we would take. However, we were never in the position, for example, to tell all our staff what to do, because when it comes to exams, then the examination committees have the power to decide whether they would like to go for a presence exam or online exam. That was very important. I mean, first we had the lockdown until summer, and then the lockdown was released. So in summer, we really had the exam period extended because of the hygiene control, but we had a presence on campus. And that was much different in fall, where the politics in Germany decided they want to have a short lockdown of 4 weeks. Well, we are still in that lockdown that was extended from November until now. So it was impossible to have these exams, and many of the teaching staff decided they want to have presence exams on campus. And of course, some of our students would organize rallies against it. So we would have the internet full of our students protesting against the exams on campus. And my position was that as vice president, I could only say, people, I really tell you, you should move to online exams. And only when it was clear that we would have the lockdown into this exam period, they decided, okay, we better go. But we couldn't dictate that to them. And so the students were really unhappy. And of course, then they had only weeks to shift from exams on the campus in presence to online exams. And we have we have supporting staff doing all the technical details for online teaching and online exams. But of course, if you have 2 weeks to go, they cannot do all the work for everyone. So it was a huge amount of uncertainty for the students. And they were very unhappy. The teaching staff was unhappy because they had to move. And so this is one of the aspects, I would say, that wasn't very positive. Other than that, we have to acknowledge that our students could study, but around 60% of our students have to work besides studying to make a living. And of course, they lost almost all of their jobs. And that's a huge problem. And then, although we are a really rich country, they got offered loans, but the loans were not very attractive. They would be without interest rates for 1 year, but then they would have interest rates that are high above the market rate. So really not a good solution to students. Then we have a state-financed system where students from poor families get state money to be able to study. And the problem is that you have to tell to the organization every now and then how many credits you studied already. And of course, the students were now in danger to not reaching these goals because they could probably not get all the credit points. So they got roughly between 70 and 95% of the credit points, depending on the study program, but nevertheless. And therefore, the politicians decided at some point to give them another free semester so that they would have to show the credits only after one semester later. And now they decided that to have 3 semesters in total, the extension. So this is good for the students, but then this holds true only for 14% of the student body. And we have many students who make a living by working and trying to really live a life that doesn't cost a lot of money. And we had these loans, and then we also had some state money, but students had to show that they do not have more than 500 euros on their bank account. And they had to show that they had more than these 500 euros before the pandemic. And so many of our students just fell between these seats because either they were poor in advance, then they wouldn't get the money, or they did have slightly more than the 500 euros, then they wouldn't get the money either. So this is not a very good situation. And I think this is one of the places where you could say, well, a rich country like Germany doesn't get it done. That was not very good. Then another aspect I would like to tell you is, of course, we have PhD students, and our PhD students are mainly on paid jobs. And they are either paid by the university, because then they have a position with a professor in the university, or they're on grant money. And of course, now that we had these several lockdowns where also the labs were shut down, the PhD students couldn't continue with their work. And with the state-run jobs by the universities, we already decided we will just extend the job period so they have more time to do their research. And this will be true for some of the grant money as well, but mainly only for certain parts. So we have the German Research Council, and they decided they will make a prolongation of the funding period to allow the PhD students to continue their work. But other granting organizations decided not to do that, which is, of course, very hard for at least those PhD students who are relying on resources on campus to do their research. So this will be difficult. It's not solved yet, and this is something we still discuss. The other aspect is by prolonging the period of funding for our current PhD student, it means that there's another cohort that will be ready to start, but there will be no jobs. Yes. And this is the downside there. And so this is the difficulties. And if I go back to teaching, the other problem is that we were also technically not in the position, for example, for hybrid teaching. So we had to invest a lot of money, and several states made investment programs for the universities to give the money so that they could buy the technical stuff to make it possible that you have hybrid teaching in a lecture hall, but also in distance with students. However, the problem was that you would get the money, and it would always be very special money, because you would get it only for 3 months, and you spend it within 3 months, or you don't have the money. Then, of course, the market is empty. You can't buy these things anymore. So that was the difficulty to allow us to build up the capacities for digital teaching from classrooms, from the money we would get. And so we're going there step by step, and it will be an improvement. And now my big question for the future will be, how will we teach after the pandemic? Because we hope for, of course, that we will go more into a blended learning. However, we see two different populations of teaching stuff, maybe. We see the ones that are really interested to make this progress also with their students, and the students like this. And there are the others who just want to go back to where they were and hope that they could go to the system that was there. But I think there won't be that system and teaching that we had before the pandemic. There will be a fundamental change. Also, the students will ask for different attempts, what you do, approaches, how to teach. I probably get too long, huh?
That was really interesting, though, every element. Thank you very much, Thomas. Lots of questions when we get to the questions period. Professor Kumar?
All right, great. Well, thank you very much for hosting this CHHE Berkeley, Margaret and Marcy, and of course my colleagues Ahmed and Thomas. I really appreciate your comments on your experiences. What I thought I will do is that I give a bit of a bird's eye view of the Indian context. Of course, it will simply need an entire day-long conference to explain the situation in India. Indian higher education system is very large. We have 1,000 universities, 40,000 plus colleges, different types of universities, public, private, and specialized institutions. The Indian higher education system itself has some 37 million plus students. And so it's a very large higher education ecosystem. And of course, as you can imagine, March 2020 fundamentally challenged this higher education system in unimaginable terms. It was simply not prepared to address this extremely, what you call uncertain at that time, but clearly unpredictable scenario that was developing. I must confess that most of my presentation will be focusing on what we as a university have done, and that will remain, I'm in the Indian context, more as an outlier, because the larger, social and economic reality in India is that the kind of education that gets offered in most of our institutions require a physical presence. While it was quite remarkable that the Ministry of Education, Government of India, and the University Grants Commission and other regulatory bodies very quickly, even before the pandemic, had focused on the role of MOOCs and online platforms in the form of Swayam were created, and new forms of technological platforms were made available for providing access to education. And the new national education policy laid emphasis on all of these matters. The reality is, little over 10% of Indian households have what we would call the three critical elements for an effective virtual online education: reasonably uninterrupted electricity, reasonably uninterrupted Wi-Fi connection, and an equipment from where educational opportunity is actually possible. So in some sense, the disparities, the inequalities that were already deeply reflected in the Indian higher education system got exacerbated during the pandemic, and the continuity of the academic engagement was to a large extent limited to the privileged institutions, and I must say that we remain one of those institutions. What I thought I will quickly do is what we ended up doing in March 2020. Now, I must confess that we were ourselves not prepared for a scenario of the kind that we faced in March 2020. COVID-19 pandemic had imposed one of the most unprecedented crises of our times, and nationwide lockdowns only complicated what was about to be unraveled at that time. Of course, at our university, we were very conscious of the larger role and responsibility that we have for the students, and how do we quickly adapt to what was expected at that time. Now, this not only required innovation in terms of technology and digital infrastructure, but also it required reimagination of curriculum, pedagogy, and even ways to continue the impact of our university towards external stakeholders. So the first few things that we did was we put up a task force, including a committee, which focused on developing the plan for what we call the pivot, which is planned intervention and virtual learning and online teaching, comprising academic and administrative leadership. We focused on the academic policies, which included grading, evaluation, attendance, code of conduct, training and mentorship of faculty, mental health and emotional well-being, data privacy, and class scheduling, the nuts and bolts of institutional building. We, of course, very early on established what is now called the Office of Academic Innovation, and began looking at the possibility of online degree programs, and ended up launching a few of them last year. And just today, we launched 3 more 100% online degree programs in collaboration with Coursera. The technological governance aspect also was given early importance, including increasing information technology team capacity a few times more than what we had, so that effective technology and process governance could be implemented. Now, as far as the students are concerned, I think we focused on 5 elements there. First was the obvious one, which was technology support. A number of activities were undertaken, including digital library, online customer relationship management framework, which will ensure that the technological support was available for students. We had an online learning management system, and of course, also ensured that the faculty members, now it's important to mention that we are a 100% residential campus, and pretty much within a few weeks, we had to transfer that entire experience into a virtual learning that involved, tying up with new platforms and policies focusing on scalability, privacy, flexibility, and feasibility of implementation. All of that was undertaken pretty much in a few weeks. That's the and I will say this, that we ended up offering 25,000 plus online classes in 2020 for all the 9 schools of JGU. The second was social support, which was about faculty office hours, online one-on-one mentoring. I, as Vice Chancellor, ended up having open houses with students, and we ended up focusing on having a pre-semester training, immersion and general engagement program for the students, for the new students who were enrolled. Because if all of us know that when March this happened, our admissions process for the new academic year was beginning. We ended up launching what is known as artificial intelligence enabled and remote proctored entrance examinations. All our admissions process moved completely online, including what was historically in the Indian context physical examination. We ended up doing an online AI enabled remote proctored entrance examination for admission to all our schools, and we've completed the process. And we ended up having, quite remarkably, 50% increase enrollment in the university, and one of our larger schools in the university, the law school, saw 70% increase enrollment as far as students are concerned. The third aspect was career support, where we ended up focusing on internships, and all our internship efforts ended up focusing on online internships for some 4,000 plus students, which were facilitated through the effort of the Office of Career Services. We were also conscious of the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on mental health. We ended up developing online support system for emotional and mental well-being of students. The Journalism of Behavioral Sciences, which is one of our institutes in collaboration with the Center for Wellness and Counseling Services, created opportunities for students to reach out. We also constituted the medical advisory board of the university and invested in upgrading the health facilities on campus, hoping that we will be able to bring students in the next several months. That was during August, and of course that never happened, and we remain a virtual university even now. So these are some of the aspects of what we ended up doing. And I will say that this has been an extraordinary learning experience for all of us. Of course, an equally difficult time for the world of higher education.
Thank you, Professor Kumar. Thank you very much. Thank you all three. Could I raise a few questions now? One of them that has come up has to do with vaccinations, and whether you were one of the, I have to admit this is a bit of a controversy in the US at institutions. Should vaccinations be required for students to enroll this coming fall? How are all of your universities looking at the vaccination issue? And also a little bit about what your plans for opening in fall are. What conditions, what requirements?
Should I start?
Go ahead, Ahmed. Yes, please.
Yeah. The vaccinations issue isn't a possibility for us because we don't have access to vaccinations at the moment.
I see.
We did actually make an argument to government that universities should be considered as congregate settings. That they should be considered for one of the early phases, if you like. But like in other parts of the world, the government decided, and with World Health Organization guidelines, decided that it should really be the older folk that get the vaccine first, because they were most at risk. Our argument was that students do represent a major vector of viral kind of spread, if you like, and that there might be some sort of argument to be made there. Having said that, we were not sort of averse to the idea of the phased rollout. I can't remember your second question, Margaret. Sorry, what was it?
Your plans for opening in the fall.
Oh yeah. So as I mentioned, our academic year has begun now already in January, February. So we're all very much at the end of our first quarter now, and what we And universities have taken different approaches. So some universities have decided to bring all their students back,
Yes.
but have in place all the kind of public health protocols together with that social compact that I spoke about earlier. And having said that, we have had a couple of outbreaks at 2 or 3 universities, but they were quite quickly brought under control. Each of the universities has established what do you call them, isolation facilities and quarantine facilities and so on. And other universities have decided that they're going to phase students in. So a lot will depend, of course, on what the trajectory of the pandemic is. But generally speaking, once the students are back on campus, then outbreaks will be managed on campus. That there's no possibility then of releasing students back into their communities, because that might actually lead to to outbreaks where there aren't outbreaks and so on. So those universities that have brought students back are going to keep their students, even if the pandemic takes an upturn, if you like. Yeah.
I see. Thomas?
That's different for us because our students don't live on campus. So we usually don't have dorms on the campus, but our students are just somewhere in the city. And so there's much more of a contact with other parts of the population. Maybe until fall, we'll be more advanced in vaccination, but probably we will not be in the position that we are allowed even to ask our students to be vaccinated to come to campus. So we are looking to see a hybrid semester. So we think we will have hygiene measures like distances, masks, and things like that, and that we will hopefully have part of the teaching on campus, because currently we are in an almost brutal lockdown. So we have just the labs on campus, but everybody else is somewhere at home, and quite isolated, that is.
Thank you. Raj?
So, well, our situation is very similar to, I suppose, South Africa and other parts of the world, particularly the developing world. We don't have a choice on the matter. The first phase of vaccination that rolled out, and the government of India had decided to vaccinate only people above 60 and healthcare workers. That got reduced to 45 plus with comorbidities. That further got reduced to 45 plus, even without comorbidities. I got my first jab on 1st of April, and I'm very, very happy and excited that just 24 hours ago, the government of India decided that people above 18 years with or without comorbidities are in a position to be vaccinated. Now, that decision is a very important one. Many of us, including I, have argued that universities should receive, special attention when it comes to vaccination of its students and faculty for the reopening itself. That does not mean that everybody will get vaccinated because it's a large country, 850 million people in India, less than 35 years of age. So, we still have a long way to go, both in terms of supply of vaccines and its availability for vaccinating young people. But new measures, including opening up of the private sector, multiple types of vaccines availability, including new players coming in, all of this is happening in a rapid pace. And I can only hope that that will have a potential impact on the immediate future. I have always maintained, and we took a very tough decision, that we simply couldn't open the campus physically, precisely for this reason, that we could not risk the possibility of COVID-19 spreading across the university. And those institutions, including some of the most leading universities in India, which opened up the campus, ended up becoming COVID clusters, and their hostels were sealed, and it created huge risk for their communities. So from our standpoint, we have so far kept the university as a virtual learning experience. We are deeply committed to the idea of opening up the campus for the fall semester. I only hope that the current situation that is really much more dangerous than what we have seen even in the first wave gets subsided. And we also hope that the vaccination effort is significantly expedited so that a larger community of people, including younger people, get vaccinated. I wonder whether we will be in a position to insist on vaccination. In fact, even before that idea, we really need to think and observe and analyze and assess, including taking into account the Government of India regulations, the Ministry of Health and other regulations in determining whether we can physically open the campus for the students with or without vaccination. Regardless of that, we need to be conscious of the larger impact of what we are seeing right now. But it has been a long journey. Almost 1 year of our entire educational experience has been without physical campus, having a physical experience of students. We are committed to the idea of opening up and having a physical experience of students, but we will keep the safety and well-being of students and faculty as paramount.
Great, great. Sounds good. I had also had a lot of questions around the issues of the status of research and how it was conducted on your campuses during the pandemic. Did funding drop? Was there funding brought to you especially, for example, to in your medical areas to study the virus and remedies for that? But a bit about what is the status of research during the period of the pandemic in each of your regions? Ahmed?
So interestingly, research output didn't drop, and that's largely because people had already somehow collected data and so on, and so they went into a writing mode, and so research output, as in publications, actually continued to, in fact, kind of operate at very much the same level as it had before. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be a knock-on effect, because when we had the hard lockdown, everything was shut down, all the laboratories and so on. So, so there is going to be some kind of impact, if you like, down the line in terms of that. But having said that, 2 big points. I mean, the one is that there was definitely additional funding for biomedical research. I mean, so that really, there was kind of a surge of funding to kind of address issues around studying the genome of the virus, and South Africa has really done exceptionally well in tracing new variants and all of that jazz. But also people have been involved in the vaccine program and so on. Having said that, in other areas there's been a fairly dramatic cut. And that's largely because of the impact on the economy. So private sector funding for research and development has really dipped significantly. And at the same time, what we've also had is government funding for research being cut because of the impact on
it has been.
on the economy. Yeah. So I think we are deeply concerned about what might happen down the line.
Thomas?
So my university doesn't have medical research, but I assume that in Germany in general, a lot of my medical research is done at the moment on viruses. I know that several of our virologists, epidemiologists are also much requested in politics, because the politicians, our government actually reached out to scientists to find the right decisions, what to do. And so science is much involved in the regulations that we find these days. And of course, that some of the research that has been done on vaccines has been done in Germany, and BioNTech, for example, and CureVac. And of course, there's a lot of research going on in these directions, and probably there will be, because what we are looking into is that probably we will see variants of this virus, and more research needed to find new vaccines in response to that. So there's an active body of research doing that in Germany.
Absolutely. Has the non-medical research continued at pre-virus levels?
Well, of course, in those areas that are not lab-based, it was not even interrupted. In the lab-based research, it was interrupted. But I would say we managed fairly well to go through this period until now.
Great, great. Raj?
Yes, we are, of course, a non-STEM and non-medicine university, and I'm very happy to report that our research productivity among our faculty members has been stellar and probably among the highest in the last decade or so. I think faculty members ended up having more time to themselves, even though they were, of course, teaching. The fact that they were working from home and there was flexibility about that enabled them to push their boundaries when it comes to having focused attention on research and writing and scholarship. So we saw that we never stopped the research policies and research related funding and including research rewards, and those things remained an important incentive for faculty members to produce that research and also publication. So from that standpoint, we are very fortunate.
Great, thank you. Well, we're getting very close to the end of the thing, but I did have one more question that I think is important, and that is, perhaps you could each answer it briefly. There's been a great deal of interest in how examination of learning on the part of students during this period, what kinds of instruments you've used, or what sort of evidence do you have of student learning during this period using the online learning?
Yeah, because we had a full year of online learning, we have some evidence now from the universities that student performance didn't really dip like during the last year. One has to ask, just and let me put it this way: I think a lot of us are skeptical of the kind of the evidence that we're getting from the universities, and we think that there might be there might be need for a much more rigorous analysis, like of what actually happened last year.
Yes, yes.
But certainly, 26 universities have kind of indicated that student performance was at least on par with the previous years. Yeah. But we are not totally convinced of it. Yeah.
Thomas?
So in Germany, most universities report that their students are doing fairly well in the exams. So it seems that despite the rough conditions, the students do a good job in learning and are also quite good in the exams. Of course, we have more than these social problems that students really suffer from having no contact to their peers. This is the most important issue, I think. With the examinations, in Germany, we debate a lot about personal rights. And so proctoring, for example, to do exams is very complicated. Online exams are somewhat complicated. However, there's a chance in that, because if you want to have competence-driven examinations, then you have more complex questions with complex answers. And of course, this is how we should deal with the students. We shouldn't have these learning questions where they just learn, and they answer the questions and then forget everything. And so there's a chance in education to really get better in examinations through this pandemic. On the other hand, our students have proved that they're quite clever. So we had one of those traditional examinations where you have to fill in things, calculate things, and get the right result. And they came up with Discord channels where they would organize themselves in a way that even though the questions came in random order, they would quickly have all the answers to all the questions and would then benefit from that. Of course, that's cheating, and that's not so good. But at least we were amazed at how clever our students are and how well organized. And we have to come up with better exams. That's the solution.
Very good, very good. Thank you, Raj.
Well, listen, one of the things that we took a call early on is that we would have to strike a very important balance between the natural tendency and commitment of universities to maintain high quality when it comes to examinations, assessment, grading, and all of that. So I outlined what I had then called the FIFA model, which is freedom, as in freedom for the faculty members to determine the different forms of assessment, innovation when it comes to determining what types of pedagogy in the learning experience, but also assessment, flexibility for the students, and adaptability from the institution standpoint. So with that framework, we ensured that examination was conducted, but we gave a lot of leeway to the individual faculty members and schools to determine what forms of assessment could be adopted to evaluate student performance, and ultimately that worked out. Of course, there were students and certain voices across the country as well, which wanted the examination system to be completely scrapped for that year, which unfortunately we couldn't, and we ended up doing an examination, albeit in an alternative manner.
All right, thank you so much to all three of you. You have really provided us very valuable and important information. I wish you all the best of luck, and I thank you very much for joining us today. Goodbye, and thank you. Thank you very